Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know people are going to be rolling in over the next couple of seconds, so I'll start with my quick opening, but thank you so much for joining us today. So welcome to our webinar with Paul LaBeouf, Vice President, Research and Development at Aperture Education, and Jennifer Robitaille, Senior Research Associate at Aperture Education as well. They are presenting on promoting educational equity through SEL assessment today. My name's Emily, and I'm going to walk you through the Zoom system before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive a replay at the end of the presentation. If you're having trouble seeing the slides, which you should see a slide right now, you should first exit the full screen view. If you can't see the slides, you can double-click on the small box at the top middle of your screen, and it should bring up the slide deck. You should also see three functions at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature can be used to ask questions or share any tech issues. Why don't we try that out and let us know your name, district or organization, and job title now. The Q&A button, this is where any questions for the presenters can be posed, as we will have some time after the webinar to do some Q&A. And finally, the raise the hand function. This feature can be used if you have any tech issues that we can handle with you via private chat one-on-one. Like I said, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so be sure to send any of your questions through the Q&A box for us to answer. The last piece I have for you today before Paul and Jennifer get underway is that we will be offering a professional development certificate for your attendance at this webinar. You will receive one within about 24 hours after the presentation. I think that's enough for the housekeeping, so without further ado, here are Paul LaBeouf and Jennifer Robitaille.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thanks to each of you for taking time to join my colleague Jen Robitaille and me in this webinar exploring how we can promote equity through social and emotional learning assessment. You know, equity in social and emotional learning is receiving more attention due in large part to the growing international focus on social justice in all aspects of life, including education. As but one example, when the landmark Handbook of Social and Emotional Learning was published just 5 years ago, none of the 37 chapters, the chapter titles, included the words equity, fairness, or social justice. In addition, the subject index did not include the terms equity, social justice, racism, or bias. Although there was substantive discussion of culture, it focused mainly on the universality or differences in cultural expression of social and emotional skills. How quickly and dramatically things have changed. In contrast to the handbook, currently at the top of the CASEL website landing page is a statement of commitment to the Black Lives Matter movement and a link to CASEL's 5-part webinar series, SEL as a Lever for Equity and Social Justice. CASEL's had a long history of promoting equity, perhaps best evidenced by the monograph Equity and Social Emotional Learning, a Cultural Analysis, written by Rob Jagers, Deborah Rivas-Drake, and Teresa Borowski in 2018. But equity is receiving much more focus and attention in the past few months, and we expect moving forward until we all do a better job at disrupting inequity and affirming the value of all the students in our country. These trends at the macro SEL level are reflected in the smaller domain of SEL assessment. When the first edition of the DESA, which is the Social Emotional Assessment published by Aperture Ed, was published a decade ago, we tested for adverse impact on children of color by comparing overall scale scores between Black, Latinx, and non-Hispanic white children. Although sufficient at the time, this approach by itself would not be sufficient today. As you will see later in this presentation, our efforts to reduce bias and promote equity become more explicit and sophisticated. But before we begin, let's manage our expectations for this webinar. You know, educational inequity, I think as we all are coming to increasingly realize, is pervasive and pernicious. And today we're just looking at one part of that issue, but we feel that it's a very important part. So we're going to look at assessment, and we're going to accomplish 3 things. We're going to examine how high quality assessment can support and strengthen educational equity. And I want to also mention here that we're looking at one kind of high quality assessment, and that's a standardized, nationally normed behavior rating scale. There are many other approaches to high quality SEL assessment, including things like participant research, qualitative research, etc. Today, we're really looking at one particular, but actually kind of very widespread type of SEL assessment. Our second goal is going to talk about what kind of quality indicators we should be looking at, specifically in regard to equity considerations when we evaluate an SEL assessment. And then third, Jen is going to talk about how we can reduce bias in both the assessment tool and also the assessment process itself. So, this discussion would be much better suited for a kind of long-term interactive professional learning community rather than a 40-minute didactic presentation. And I must admit that I'm feeling kind of a sense of humility going into this. I thought I was a fairly woke person when it came to issues of equity, having been in the SEL field for quite a long time, but the more recent events and the discussion it's provoked and the webinars I've watched and the readings that I've done have really indicated to me more than ever my position of white privilege and really how little in many ways I know and appreciate about this issue. So we really do encourage your comments and discussion, and I hope we can find a way that as a profession we can continue to advance our practice in this field. So let's talk about the first objective. How does high quality assessment support and strengthen our equity efforts, specifically in the SEL field? So just to kind of set the stage, I want to give you a couple definitions of educational equity so that we're all on the same page. This first one is from the monograph that I mentioned, published by Castle, by Jaggers, Rivas, Drake, and Borowski. And they talk about educational equity as meaning that every student, I think that's the key phrase here, every student has access to resources and educational rigor at the right moment, regardless of their demographic features, in order to be successful. A second definition here provided by the Center for Public Education states that equity is achieved when all students receive the resources they need so they graduate prepared for success after high school. So the focus here is on every student in the classroom, or all students within our school systems or out of school time programs. Which leads me to this equity. I believe, we're not going to get into it today, but I would think that most people on this call do believe that social and emotional competence is essential for success in school and ultimately in life. And there have been many literature reviews and meta-analyses that have pretty well established that. So we believe it's essential for success in school. We know that it can be taught. There are many good evidence-based programs out there that have demonstrated their efficacy in teaching these SEL skills. We also know that, like any human characteristic, students are going to differ in their level of social and emotional competence. We're going to have some students in our class that have very well established behavioral repertoires of social emotional skills, and other students that have not yet developed those skills. So there's difference in the level of social emotional competence. This means, therefore, that we're going to have differentiated SEL instruction if we want to have equitable outcomes. If we believe that every student in our schools should be socially and emotionally competent, and that they differ in their baseline level of social emotional competence, then we have to somehow differentiate instruction to address those differences. And if you're going to differentiate instruction, that means that you have to have an understanding and an awareness of each student's social emotional strengths and opportunities for growth. And that, I believe, means that we have to assess these skills. So one might ask, is this our current kind of typical practice? And before we explore that, I want to talk just very briefly about the DESA, because I'm going to use that to illustrate how we can use assessment to promote equity in social and emotional learning. So the DESA, if you're not familiar with it, is a nationally normed behavior rating scale that looks at a variety of positive behaviors related to social emotional competence in students in kindergarten through the 12th grade. It can be completed by teachers. Currently, the elementary and middle school versions can be completed by parents, and the high school version is also offers a student self-report. The different skills that are measured with the DESA are based on the CASEL framework. So on the outside ring here, we have the CASEL 5 constructs, and within the DESA, we've divided them into 8 kind of component parts. So a couple of these different CASEL domains, like self-awareness, we have subdivided into subsets like optimistic thinking and self-awareness. So it is a CASEL-aligned framework. The way we talk about results, which you'll see on the next slide, is being a strength-based assessment. High scores indicate a strength. So we actually use that term strength to characterize the top 16% or so of students in our national standardization sample. About 2/3 of children will fall in what we refer to as the typical range, in the middle of the distribution. And then 16% of students who have not yet developed these skills, we use the term need for instruction to characterize that current level of skill exhibition. So please note the language I'm using. We're not saying that these are somehow children that have a deficit in social-emotional learning. We're just saying that at this point in time, they are not yet evidencing this skill set in their behavioral repertoire, and there's a need for instruction. Somebody needs to teach them these important skills. So how can we use this to promote equity? Well, here's one of our group reports. And in this report, each row indicates an individual student in the classroom. Each column indicates one of the 8 different domains that we're measuring with the DESA. So you can read across a row and see the results for any individual student. You can also look down a column and see how your classroom or group of students is doing as a whole. So in this case, a blue cell indicates a typical score, a green cell indicates a strength, and a red cell indicates a need for instruction. So if we look at this first row, Michaela B, we can see that she has typical scores indicated by the blue squares in a number of different domains. She has 1 strength in optimistic thinking, but also has a couple needs for instruction in goal-directed behavior and self-aware and social awareness. Similarly, we can look down a column and we can see that in the domain of personal responsibility, every student in our classroom either has a typical score or a strength. But in comparison, in optimistic thinking, we see that I have 4 students that really need some instruction and some attention to this particular area in order to develop that skill set. So how can we use this to support equity? The first way is by prioritizing areas for Tier 1 instruction. So if I want to make sure that all the students in my class have this set of skills, I might want to spend more time in that second area, the second column, optimistic thinking, than I do in the first column, personal responsibility, because I have 4 students in my classroom who are kind of struggling in that area. So I might want to spend more time on those lessons that deal with optimistic thinking. I want to make sure that my classroom routines and rituals reflect a sense of optimism, that I as a teacher am modeling optimism. I might want to come back and revisit this often throughout the week or throughout the month, term, and year. And I want to make sure that those students are really actively engaged in whatever activities we're doing to try to promote optimism. Similarly, at Tier 2, I can use this data to form pull-out groups. And so I might take those 4 students who are not yet really demonstrating a lot of optimistic thinking and create a pull-out group that really focuses on that for those students. And the third way we can use it, which I think is really important, is for evaluation and accountability. We need to be able to review our progress over the course of a year in a classroom, in a school, or in a district, and see what areas are we really good at impacting and teaching, and what areas maybe do we really need to improve our efficacy at teaching these skills, and then use that information for quality improvement. So this is an example of how we can utilize good assessment to make sure that every student in our schools is receiving differentiated instruction designed to ensure that they are given the opportunity to develop these skills by the time that they are promoted or graduate. Another way we can think about this, kind of another image or metaphor, and before I put it up there, I want to say I know that there's a lot of excess meaning with this slide, but in our case, I want you to think of the differences in the heights of the students as representing nothing more than their social-emotional competence. And what we're seeing here is sort of education as usual. There are some students who have a really strong set of social-emotional skills. They're able to participate in school, benefit from instruction, they're going to do well. There are other students that maybe are in the typical range that are really going to have to struggle more in order to benefit from instruction. And then we have students who have not yet acquired these skills that really need a lot of additional support. Without a good SEL program, this is what happens. No measurement is made. We're not necessarily aware of these differences, and there's no differentiation of instruction. So maybe we do a universal SEL program. So every student gets the same set of supports done pretty much the same way. And we see that now the student in the typical range is able to participate more fully. But the student that has not yet acquired these skills is still struggling. That universal program is not quite enough. So of course, what we need is more differentiation. We need almost a tiered approach where the student on the right is now receiving additional supports that they need in order to benefit. And how do we know what those supports are unless we're assessing the skill sets? How do we know, to use this metaphor, how many boxes and which particular boxes we need to provide to the student to be successful? So our first take-home message today is that we believe that an SEL program that is really committed to equity has to assess each student's social and emotional skills in order to guide instruction. That's why we do it, not to come up with a score, but to guide instruction to ensure that every student has the skills they need to be successful. So, if we're going to use an assessment to make these decisions, we need to think about our second objective, which are what are the quality indicators we should be looking at that relate specifically to equity. So that's our second objective that we're going to address now. So of course, like any assessment, we need to ensure that the tools we're using to make important decisions about students have solid evidence of their reliability and their validity for their intended purposes. If you're using a poorly developed tool that does not provide this data, you're going to be making bad decisions based on bad data, which is going to lead to misallocation of resources and likely disappointing results. We should also make sure that the assessment provides guidelines for the interpretation and use of the data, and uses the data that's supported by research. Those are general requirements. There are also some specific things we should look for in regards to equity. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of these in turn. So we want them to be strength-based. They need to be reviewed for cultural appropriateness. We believe they should be nationally normed, and they need to be evaluated for bias. So why do we need to be strength-based? Well, there are a number of reasons. The first is that when we think of SEL and what we're trying to achieve in schools, it should not just be the absence of behavioral problems, but we should really be promoting thriving in each student. So when we think about a SEL measure, we should be looking for the demonstration of student strengths, not just the absence of internalizing or externalizing behavior problems. The absence of a problem does not mean that the student is thriving in our environment. Secondly, we have to think about how the questions that we ask, what we're measuring, is going to direct our attention. If I'm using a screener that talks a lot about internalizing and externalizing problems, that's what I'm going to be attending to. And I believe, particularly from an equity perspective, we need to be honoring the strengths and the assets of our students and not focused so much on behavioral problems. Not that behavioral problems may not be important, but instead because I don't believe we do enough to honor and recognize and promote and value the strengths that our students bring to our classrooms. Third, Jaeger is going again, well, this is actually a previous article that he wrote where he defined the term transformative SEL. He says it is based on strong and respectful relationships. And if you want to develop a strong and respectful relationship with a student, doing so by talking about their strengths, I think, is much more effective than talking about their behavioral problems or deficits. Also, when we write our LinkedIn profiles, how many of us talk about our deficits? How many of us, like if I were to write mine, say I'm a horrible piano player and I've never been at all capable in any kind of sport event that involves a ball? That is not what my LinkedIn profile says. I do not define myself by my deficits. I would like to think that I define myself by my strengths. And I think we should extend that same courtesy to our students and think about defining them not by their deficits, but by their strengths. Also, from a practical point of view, it is much more acceptable to parents and I think to teachers, because it's more consistent with how they view their role as an educator, to be talking about a child's strengths, and therefore it's easier to get buy-in. So if you're an administrator, you want to do universal screening, I think you're going to have an easier time screening for strengths than screening for behavioral problems. And lastly, I think it's just a more helpful and more hopeful approach when we think about supporting the students in our classrooms. So how about cultural competence, the second criterion I mentioned? Most social emotional competencies seem to be fairly universal, although the way that we express them may differ. So our colleague Dave Adams at the Urban Assembly in New York once used the example that, one of the items on the DESA is greets others in a polite way. And almost all cultures are going to value that behavior, greeting other people in a polite way, although the way we do it might be different. So as Dave pointed out, in our culture, our Western culture, particularly kind of the white dominant Western culture, the preferred way that we greet somebody is with a handshake. That might change now as a result of COVID, but traditionally that's been the way we do it. If you're in an Asian culture, it might be through bowing. If you're in the military, it might be through saluting. If you're an urban youth, it might be through a fist bump. But in each case, we're trying to do the same thing, greet another person in a polite way. However, not all behaviors, not all social emotional skills are universally valued. So when we developed the DESA, we had the items reviewed from a kind of a cultural lens. One of our original items was makes eye contact with adults when speaking with them. That is not a valued behavior in some cultures, so we removed it. Similarly, and this is becoming more apparent to us, not all cultures value individual achievement as much as kind of the dominant Western culture does. There might be more of an emphasis on collective effort. So we really need to review our assessments from this cultural lens. And it really needs to be done by cultural experts. But of course, the issue is how many cultures and which cultures do we review? And I think that depends upon the students that you're serving and the cultures that are represented in your schools and your communities. So you might have to do a cultural adaptation of the assessment or look for assessment that does have more cultural reviews available for it. And this is a little bit of a soapbox for me. There are some SEL assessments out there that promote themselves with this global term like, we are culturally appropriate. I think that is a nonsensical term. It's like saying all lives matter. In the Philadelphia schools, and I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, there are over 100 cultures, over 100 languages represented in that school district. So what does it mean to say you're culturally appropriate? For what? Did you test for all 100 of those cultures? So I think we need to have kind of a higher standard when it comes to talking about cultural appropriateness. And finally, and this is an aspirational goal for us at Aperture, we need to move from this notion of being culture fair and kind of non-discriminatory to more culture affirming, where we're not just trying to avoid anything that was specific to a culture, but really trying to represent the variety of cultures and to promote and affirm the strengths of those cultures. So that will be a direction that we will be emphasizing as we move forward. Okay, the importance of national norms. This is the third criterion. And this all has to do with whom do we want to compare our students? What should the reference group be? And I want to give what I think might be a familiar example, although the last time I presented this, a lot of the graduate students had never heard of the movie Animal House. So if you're familiar with Animal House, it's a comedy movie about a group of frat boys set in the 1960s. And they're all a little bit of kind of misfits. And at one point, we learn about their academic standing. We find out that Kruger, this guy here, was sort of the average student for the frat. Hoover, this gentleman, who's actually the president of the frat, had the highest GPA. He was in the 95th percentile for Delta House, the name of their frat. And of course, Blutarsky was in the 5th percentile. He had the lowest GPA within the school. So we had the 95th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 5th percentile based on our local norms. But then there's another scene where they meet with the dean, and dean then presents to them what their actual GPAs are. Kruger's 1.2, Hoover's 1.6, and Blutarsky is famously 0.0. So the point here is, if you were Mr. Hoover's parents and he proudly told you he was in the 95th percentile, but then you found out that his GPA was actually 1.6, would you feel that you were misled? because, using a more kind of national or standardized scale, he doesn't look nearly as good as he does with the local norms. To put this in a more personal level, I went to a good, selective, but not highly selective state school as an undergrad. It was a small state school, and I was, frankly, the standout student in the psychology department. When I graduated, I won the psychology award. I was actually gained acceptance to an elite graduate program. And I walked into my first day of class thinking I was hot stuff, right? I was the #1 student in my school. And I very quickly was disabused of that notion and realized that I was, really going to have to struggle to be competitive with the other students in that graduate program. And I was blindsided by that. I thought, coming from my small state college, that I was going to be a very competitive student, and I was really taken aback, and it was quite an adjustment for me. So I think when we think about our students who are going to go out and compete, for acceptance into state colleges, state universities, or in employment, and who are they going to be competing against, what's the frame of reference that we want to use? And although there are arguments to be made on both sides, from our perspective, we think that the national norms might be a more useful frame of reference. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before Jen takes over in a few minutes here is the importance of testing for bias and what this is really all about. So I want to begin with this slide. So what we have here is two distributions, and I've labeled the one on the right as purple students and the one on the left as orange students. These are their scores, we could say, on the DESA, a nationally standardized norm reference assessment. And we see that in general, although there's a lot of overlap in the distributions, the purple students have somewhat higher scores than the orange students. The mean, or kind of the top of the distributions, is higher, more to the right for the purple students. And out at the tail end of the distribution, that green area, which remember on the desk would be a strength, we can see that there are more purple students out in that kind of favorable end of the distribution than there are orange students. But the question is, what is this graph telling us? We know from looking at this that in general, purple students have higher scores than orange students, but what do we attribute that to? And there are a number of different possible explanations. The first is that the assessment itself is biased, that it disadvantages orange students by perhaps not appropriately reflecting their culture. So the difference we're seeing here is a result of a badly developed instrument and is reflective of assessment bias. But an alternative explanation might be that what we're looking at here is the result of societal disadvantage and kind of pernicious inequity, that the orange students are attending a school district that has lower resources, has less well-prepared teachers, has less opportunities for community involvement or for extracurricular activities, etc. And what we're seeing is a real difference in social-emotional competence that is a result of societal disadvantage. So how do we tease that out? How do we know what we're dealing with here? And the key insight for understanding how we approach this is that if you think about it, two students, so here's the little purple guy and here's the little orange guy, two students that have the same overall level of social-emotional competence. So at the same point on this distribution, whether it's in the strength range, the typical range, or down here in the need for instruction range, if they're at the same point in this distribution, meaning they have the same overall level of social-emotional competence, their performance or their scores on those assessments, on each item in the assessment, should be the same. So let me just kind of rephrase that. We're really looking at groups of students here, not an individual student, but the notion is that all students who score in the strength range should look pretty much the same on all the items, even though the distributions might differ. So we have to go and we have to look at individual items. So on this slide here, we're showing what does it look like if there's no what we call differential item functioning, meaning that the purple student and the orange student tend to have the same kind of scores on that item, meaning it's not biased. Okay, so whether the response was they never engage in this behavior, remember important information, or they almost always, the relative percentages, kind of the performance of these two groups of kids looks the same on this item. But what if instead we see something like this, where the orange students have a much greater probability of being rated as never showing that behavior, and the purple students have a much greater percentage of being rated as almost always showing that behavior. This differential item functioning indicates that this item is biased, that orange students and purple students, even when they're at the same overall level of social-emotional competence, are performing differently on this item. And then what you do at that point, if you're an assessment developer, is you get rid of this damn item, right? Because it's discriminating against a particular group of students. So what we should do, and what we're doing now in Aperture Education, and many other good SEL assessments do the same thing. This is not unique to us. This is kind of the standard of practice at this point, is we go through and we examine each of our items. We identify any that might show this differential item functioning, and we either change it or we get rid of it. So that when we look at a difference like this, we know that it's not a result of item bias, but it's reflecting something else, and one of those possibilities might be that we're seeing a real difference in students' performance that relates to social justice issues, that these students do not have the same opportunities as these students do for acquiring whatever the skill set might be. So our second take-home message here is that when we think about doing social and emotional assessment, we should look for assessments that have been evaluated for potential adverse impact on disadvantaged, vulnerable, or non-dominant culture students. And we should expect assessment developers and publishers to provide us with this information. That's their obligation. They should be able to provide that information to you. So this differential item functioning should be used regardless to verify that the assessment items do not reflect bias. But it's really important if you see that there are group differences, so that you can begin to tease out what that difference might be due to, and then have an appropriate response to help minimize that kind of SEL skills gap. So with that, Jen, I'll turn it over to you to talk about our third educational objective.
Great, thank you, Paul. So for our third and final objective of this presentation, we're going to discuss how to reduce bias in both the assessment tool itself and also just the broader assessment process, specifically in the completion of assessment ratings. So you may have heard or be familiar with the term rater bias, which is often used in reference to assessments such as the DESA, which require a rater, often a teacher or a parent, to interpret, reflect, and then make a judgment about the behaviors that are being rated for a student. When people talk about rater bias, what they're referencing is some kind of systematic variation in an assessment scores that can be attributed to factors related to the person completing the rating rather than the actual student being rated. And rater bias can occur when there's something about the student, so for example, some kind of specific characteristic about the student that influences the way the rater perceives and then rates that student. Rater bias can also occur when you have different raters who are reacting to the same set of questions differently, regardless of the students that they're rating. So for example, you might have somebody whose ratings tend to trend a little bit more positively, whereas you might have others whose ratings may trend a little bit more negative. The issue of rater bias in itself is important. It's an important issue because when it's present, it can cause the assessment scores to be less precise or less reliably measure the construct of interest. And this in turn impacts the educational decisions that we're making about students. So our colleague and co-author of the DESA, Valerie Shapiro, and her colleagues have studied the issue of rater bias in relation to DESA ratings. In her work, she's found that when accounting for the factors that influence DESA scores, the characteristics of the rater, and in this case, we're talking about teacher raters, the characteristics of the rater only account for 16% of the variance in a DESA scores. And to put this into context, researchers who have studied rater bias in other assessment tools have generally found somewhere between 20% to 50% of the variance in scores to be attributed to characteristics of the rater. So we're seeing here in this study less influence from the raters themselves compared to what's been found in other studies of other assessment tools. But what's really critical and important about this study is that Valerie and her colleagues further found that this variance can actually be reduced further to only 10% by providing teachers with training about SEL, as well as providing teachers with support as they implement SEL. And this is because in her findings, she found that some of the teacher characteristics that influenced DESA scores were found to be related to their understanding of social and emotional learning, as well as their beliefs about their ability to implement SEL well. And these are things that we can address through training. So for example, we can provide teachers with a good solid foundation on social and emotional learning, and we can also ensure that teachers really understand why they're being asked to complete ratings, how the data for these ratings will be used, and ultimately that the point of completing these ratings is to support their students. And this training can really help us reduce the small amount of rater bias that are found in completing assessments. So in addition to the work by Valerie and others, we also know from several recent national surveys that although educators report valuing SEL, they also at the same time are reporting a need for more training and more support for how they can effectively promote their students' social and emotional competence. They specifically ask for both more general knowledge related to SEL, as well as guidance for how they can effectively teach and integrate SEL into their existing curricula. And we also know that there's currently very few pre-service teacher preparation programs in colleges and universities that provide explicit instruction related to SEL or as part of coursework. And similarly, there's currently no praxis exams or any kind of similar certification process for teaching SEL. And so this forms this knowledge and practice gap that educators are talking about. And it's led both our team as well as many others in the field to begin to develop resources and programs that can help support educators around social and emotional learning. So I'm just going to very briefly share one example of an educator professional development program around SEL. There are others out there and other really good resources in the field, but I'm just going to share as an example a program that our team has developed called EdCert. EdCert focuses on supporting educators' social and emotional knowledge, as well as their skill set and their well-being. It provides content around the same 8 social and emotional competencies measured by the DESA, which Paul talked about earlier in the presentation. And so with EdCert, educators, and when I refer to educators, I mean both school teachers, K-12, as well as out-of-school time program staff. They participate in EdCert and they receive professional development around these 8 social and emotional competencies in SEL more broadly to enhance their knowledge. They participate in self-reflection to understand their own current attitudes, beliefs, and practices related to social and emotional learning and these competencies specifically. They go through guided planning to identify areas of focus to enhance their SEL practice, and then strategies that are aligned to the reflective tools that they complete, which are ultimately designed to help improve practice. And so the goal here with a program like EdCert is to support teachers in developing their knowledge and their practice around SEL. And again, this training, aside from just being supportive of teachers as well as helping students, it can also help us when we think back to reducing the potential bias in completing assessments. So I mentioned that a key part of EdCert involves self-reflection. And this is really important as we think about raising our awareness about our current beliefs and our practices. And it's often included as a first step when we think about any kind of behavior change or behavior modification program. So here's just one example of one of these self-reflective tools for EdCert. This is on social awareness. And as you can see here on this screen, It includes 10 practices, and educators would go through and reflect on those 10 practices and self-assess themselves on their current use of those practices. So as an example, item number 3 here on the screen reads, I take time to get to know the cultural backgrounds of my students, and I actively celebrate and promote an appreciation for diversity in my classroom. Similarly, item number 5 reads, I acknowledge and work to address my own biases or prejudices, again, during interactions and in my teaching practices. So you can see these items relate specifically to teaching practices in the classroom, and they cover both our own beliefs and our practices as educators, as well as they deal with interactions that educators may have both with students as well as others in the school, such as their colleagues. And once educators complete these self-assessments, they receive strategies to help enhance the practices that they choose as focus areas. So I just will quickly share with you 2 examples of strategies from social awareness. The first here on the screen is called My Professional Circles Inventory, which focuses on raising awareness of potential biases that one may hold about colleagues and students. So the strategy involves setting aside time to complete a series of reflective prompts. You go through it first about your colleagues and then second about your students. And you're asked to think about the individuals who fall within your circle. What we mean by circle is those you typically interact with, those you get along with well, and in terms of students, those who you think might be good learners, for example. At the same time, you also think about who might be missing from those circles and why they might be missing. And so this strategy is designed to help you start thinking and identifying any potential biases that you may hold about others. And then a second example of a social awareness strategy is more focused on specific practices and interactions with students. So this one is called My Students' Names and focuses on classroom strategies that help educators promote cultural sensitivity and appreciation for diversity in the classroom. As the name of the strategy implies, it includes techniques for helping educators learn the correct pronunciation of students' names before they arrive in their classrooms on the first day of school. It also provides some ideas for classroom activities that involve, having students share the meaning behind their names, maybe their family history or the family history behind their names, as well as any kind of importance or significance that their names have. So this was just a very quick overview of one type of training program related to social and emotional learning for educators. And to sort of take it back to where I started in this section, as we discussed, a key part of reducing assessment bias involves ensuring that we minimize any bias that can be attributed to raters as part of the assessment process. And rater bias, we found, can be minimized by providing effective pre-service and in-service training and support around social and emotional learning. And in order for that to be effective, approaches need to emphasize both an awareness raising as well as providing skills that can help reduce bias and promote equity. And so this is an important strategy when we think of reducing bias in the assessment process. So that brings us to the end, and I just have one concluding slide here to wrap up. So to summarize what we've discussed here today, the first is that we believe a commitment to equity requires first an assessment of individual students that ensures that each student has the skills that they need to be successful. Second, requires attention to the psychometric properties of the assessment in order to ensure it is of a high quality and free from bias. And then lastly, it needs to provide effective pre-service and in-service education to staff to help reduce biases in the assessment process. Now, what we've Paul and I have presented here today should in no way be considered, the silver bullet or, that quick and easy solution to what's a very difficult problem. Rather, we like to think of it more as silver buckshot, component pieces of an overall comprehensive strategy or approach to address educational equity in SEL. And we consider what we have presented here today as necessary, but certainly not sufficient in promoting equity of SEL. And we also know that there's many leaders in the SEL field that have focused on equity for quite a while. For others of us, the importance of this issue has been highlighted by the recent Black Lives Matter movement. And as we all strive to promote equitable SEL education, we truly hope that we can continue to share successful strategies and our various experiences as part of an ongoing learning community. So with that, I thank you all, and I will turn it back over to Emily.
Thank you both, Paul and Jen, for giving us such a great presentation. So we have had a couple questions that I'd like to send to you guys, and I am going to start with one of our most common that I'll actually answer is that yes, we will absolutely be providing the slides for everybody in our follow-up email, and you'll also be receiving that certificate of attendance within about 24 hours, although I expect it to be today. Some of the other questions that we had were, is the Shapiro et al. Publication only specific to rater bias in the DESA, and is there data on rater bias for the DESA SSE?
I can take that. That's a great question. The Shapiro et al. Paper focuses on the DESA and the DESA Mini, the DESA Mini being a brief, shortened version of the full DESA assessment that's used for universal screening. We do not cover the DESA second step edition within that paper. I'm not aware of a paper looking at rater bias on the DESA second step edition.
Okay, thank you. And another question that we have is, how are the assessments presented in regards to gender inclusion?
I'll be happy to take that one. It's, kind of an interesting question. First of all, when we developed the DESA, we having a nationally representative standardization sample, we wanted to make sure that we had, a good, again, representative sample of both boys and girls, males and females on the DESA. We do align our standardization data to the data in the United States Census. So if part of what you're asking is, how do we identify or differentiate different genders and gender identities, in the standardization sample, we had, particularly with the DESA, we had male and female. However, in our actual application where we use it in practice, we do provide for more options. But when you're doing the standardization sample, you want to align yourself against the national data. And at that point, the US Census data was not considering any more than 2 options. So that's what we use. In terms of our results and how we look at differences between boys and girls in social and emotional competence, we, like everybody else in the field, has found that at any given age level, girls tend to show more overall social emotional competence than do boys. So that then raises the question, so what do you do with that difference, right? And if you're talking about a standardized test, there are really 2 ways you can go. You can either have one set of norms that you apply to both boys and girls, kind of one yardstick, so to speak, that they're being measured against, or you can have separate norms for boys and separate norms for girls. And we gave this a lot of thought, and we ultimately decided that we did not want to have separate norms for boys and girls for a number of reasons. One is that we feel that, social and emotional competence, there should be one set of standards. When we think about what is a socially and emotionally competent person, I don't want to have to start parsing that out by gender. And also, in a different way, it can sort of be discriminatory against girls. So remember, girls tend to have higher social emotional skills than boys. So you could have a boy that compared to other boys, you would say, well, this student really has some pretty strong social emotional skills. But if you were a girl, it wouldn't be nearly that strong. So it's almost like saying, well, he's pretty good for a boy. Um, and in reverse, if you're a girl, if you had a score that was below the mean for a girl, so you're like in the lower half of the distribution, that same level of skill demonstration could be well above the mean for a boy. So we would have a different set of expectations for girls, to use the old nursery rhyme, they're supposed to be sugar and spice and everything nice because they're a girl. Whereas with a boy, it's like, well, he's a boy, so that's good enough. And we weren't comfortable with that. We think when it comes to social emotional competence, we should have one set of standards, at least as far as gender goes. Again, the way that boys and girls express those behaviors might differ, but in terms of overall competence, we'd kind of want to hold them to, that's probably not the best language used. We want to have one equitable and fair standard that we're applying across those genders and not having different expectations based on gender. Now, again, that's a value statement, right? And some people might say, that they disagree with us in that approach. And I think there's a discussion to be had here. But ultimately, we had to make a decision, and the decision that we made was to provide one set of kind of standards or expectations independent of gender.
Thank you, Paul. I've seen a lot of affirmation of what you just said in our chat box and in the questions as well. So I think a lot of people appreciate the direction that you guys decided to go on that. And thank you so much for sharing that as well. I have a lot of questions on the EdCert program. One specifically asked, has the EdCert been used outside of the United States? And they're looking for Australia specifically.
Sure, I can take that. At this point, no, EdCert has not been used outside of the US. It is actually a pretty new program. We have not had the opportunity yet to use it outside the US. We would certainly be interested in doing that.
And another question on EdCert is, how does the EdCert program work and how long does it take?
Yeah, good question. So the EdCert program is laid out essentially as 8 modules, and each module is one of the 8 social and emotional competencies that we shared in the presentation. And how it works, basically, we typically recommend that an entire school or an entire out-of-school time program would adopt EdCert for all of their teachers, and that everybody in the school would work through those 8 modules together as a group, in the sense of everybody focused on, for example, self-awareness at the same time, or relationship skills at the same time. And we typically recommend that you spend about a month per module, which works out really well in terms of the length of a typical school year, being able to get through all 8 modules. And at this point, there are professional development sessions as part of EdCert. They're really brief, about 10 to 15 minutes or so, that staff would watch those recordings, those webinars, trainings. And then they would go through, personally, they would go through and complete a self-reflective assessment on each of those 8 competencies, again, 1 per month, and go through a process of reflecting on their practices, and then planning, using the strategies and other strategies they might have to choose areas of focus, and then implement those strategies across that month and ideally beyond. So that's typically sort of how we recommend it to be used and how we've seen folks use it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen. We have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to keep going because there are so many questions pouring in. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, so if you've submitted a question and it isn't answered live, I do have them copied and we will respond one-on-one on them. So don't worry if I don't get to it live. And again, there's so many, I'm having a hard time choosing. Lots of additional questions on getting the certificate of attendance. If you logged in today, you will be getting a copy sent to the email that you logged in with. So be sure to check your email for that. The question is, who facilitates the assessment to school staff?
I'm not sure I totally understand what that question means. So if it's an EdCert question, it is a self-administered, self-reflective assessment. So typically a school leader would provide an opportunity for staff, protect some time for them in order to complete the self-assessment and do the planning process. If you're talking about the DESA assessment, we do provide a variety of different training options ranging from pre-recorded webinars to live on-site training. It is generally facilitated by somebody at the district level who sets up the time periods in which the ratings are going to occur, and it's all web-based. We have an online platform that delivers the assessment, so that it's kind of all kind of queued up for the teacher. But ultimately, it's the teacher who's completing the DESA. So we provide training to them on how to best administer and interpret and use the data, but then it's the teacher themselves who do the assessment.
Excellent. I think you're right that it was aimed at the EdCert material.
Okay.
We mentioned the second step program. What's the difference between the traditional DESA and the DESA second step edition?
Yeah, I'll jump in there, but Jen, feel free to jump in as well. The main difference between the two versions is the framework that the scales align to. So with the DESA, we have those 8 different social-emotional competencies, which are in turn aligned to the CASEL 5 social-emotional domains, the CASEL framework. With the second step edition, the items and the scales align to the second step program. So second step has 4 social-emotional skills that they focus on, and the items and the scales on the DESA reflect that framework rather than the CASEL framework. So that's the biggest difference between the two. There are some minor differences in terms of different analytic tools and different reports that are available. But the main difference, I think, is just the scales, what we're actually measuring. Different scales aligned to a different framework.
Excellent. And I have a question regarding a school who doesn't have an assessment or refuses to use one. Do you have any tips for them in starting an SEL program or within their SEL program if they don't have access to an assessment?
Well, sure. So, obviously, having sat in on this webinar, that we're, big proponents of doing assessment. But if you think back to that build we had with the 3 kids standing on the fence, universal SEL programs, if you choose a good one, right? And CASEL has a list of what they call the CASEL Select, like SEL ACT Select programs that have been reviewed and have been found to meet, basic quality standards. If you use a good SEL program and you train your staff well on how to use it and you implement it with fidelity, it's going to have positive impacts on kids. So even that, the student with the weakest social emotional skills or the most needs for growth still benefited from that universal SEL program. So we think SEL, we believe in a data-driven approach where we are differentiating the way we do SEL based on the kids that are actually in our school and the kids that are actually in the classroom. But if your school does not yet use an assessment, I still think you're better off using a good SEL program than using none at all. And you can, many places will find that if you use a good SEL program, you can see impact in other areas. So you might see greater attendance, you might see fewer office disciplinary referrals. There are lots of good socially valid measures that you could look at that would give you some idea of the impact of your SEL program. But I would still argue at some point that that a good next step would be to introduce a good assessment into the program as well.
Well, as you said, we are very pro-assessment at Aperture Education. So very last question, because I do think it's very important. So for middle school, as an example, if we have 2 teachers rate 1 student, will that provide a more accurate rating?
Uh, Let me clarify that. So we would recommend strongly that if you have two teachers rate a student, they do so independently. Um, so when you say, would it produce a more accurate rating, and that was singular, we would say no. We really do not recommend teams doing ratings of kids. And the reason is that students have different relationships with different teachers. And so a student, given the way a teacher designs their classroom, given the culture and climate of that classroom, given the ability of that teacher to form relationships with kids, might see a different set of behaviors than a student that doesn't have that kind of environment and that kind of relationship with the teacher. So if you have the two ratings and the teachers can discuss them, and the one teacher can say, well, I don't understand. You're seeing a lot of this in your classroom. I don't see it in mine. Can you, tell me, how do you get the student to do that? How do you provide that, that opportunity? It can result in a more complete picture of the student than one rating by itself. But I wouldn't recommend combining ratings or doing ratings as a team, because then you kind of get this, you can end up with an average that doesn't represent anybody's real experience, and most importantly, doesn't represent the student's best experience.
Excellent. I think they were framing the question as if they did two separate, as their follow-up question is, if there's a discrepancy, what do you do with the scores?
So I think I kind of hinted at that in the last answer. First of all, we actually try to evaluate whether the difference between the raters is meaningful or not, because we don't want to overinterpret small differences. We have guidance that we provide on how to do that. But if you find that teachers actually are reporting something very different in the student's behavior, our belief for our approach is that leads to a discussion like the one I just mentioned, which is sort of, tell me, how do you get the student, what do you see that shows that this student works well in groups? And you might find that it's more of a student self-directed group than a teacher-directed group that gives more opportunity for students to show those skills, which can then become suggestions for the teacher who's not seeing those behaviors on how they can modify their classroom practices to do a better job of eliciting and supporting social emotional strengths in kids.
Excellent. I think that's exactly what they were looking for. And I think that's also really important, that we find a great larger picture for our students. And
I just want to insert one thing there just real quickly. I know we're running out of time. However, having said all that, our research shows that teachers are actually pretty darn consistent. So sometimes you do see those differences, but they're not the norm. Most teachers are really good perceivers of kids' behaviors, and most teachers are pretty good at structuring their classrooms in ways to support kids. So it's a good practice to get different ratings, but much more often you'll get agreement than you get significant differences between them.
Excellent. And like you mentioned, Paul, we have reached the end. We've actually gone a little bit over. So we appreciate everybody who has stuck with us this far. Again, we have so many great questions that we were not able to get to all of them live, but we will respond one-on-one if we have your name associated with it. Thank you to Jen and Paul for giving us such a great presentation. I see a lot of you agree with me that we really enjoyed this. So thank you to all you educators out there for joining us, and we really appreciate all that you do for your students and for our communities. So thank you so much, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.